So, I am here today with Dr. Harriet Fraad, who is a mental health counselor and host of Capitalism Hits Home, a podcast that deals with, quote, the mutual shaping of economic life, political life, cultural life, and personal life in the United States. And her work is supported by Democracy at Work. She discusses family, meaning, isolation, connection, and more in the context of a broken economic system, which is incredibly relevant to this project and seems to be a too often underreported angle. So, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Me too. Glad to be here.
So let's first get into, Americans aren't getting married and having kids like they used to. Why is that in your opinion?
Well, I think it's what has happened in the United States is that, first of all, women now have two jobs if they get married and have kids. Because in the 1970s, because we have an overwhelmingly capitalist system with two chances to vote, both capitalists are running. It's not like being in France where there's the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, this socialists, or that socialists, and so on, or in many other places all over Scandinavia. We have two capitalist parties, and we didn't have any rules against outsourcing, and so the unionized, well-paid, millions and millions of jobs in manufacturing. Once we got computers and fast jet travel and things like faxes, those jobs were outsourced to places with low wages and no ecological protections or very weak ones and very weak benefits. And so our capitalists made enormous amounts of money. And America, which had been the most egalitarian nation that was a developed nation in the world, became one of the least egalitarian nations in the developed world. And money accumulated at the top and was able to buy our political system because we don't have rules like they do in France, Germany, all over Scandinavia, where you can't have private money in elections and where you can't buy TV time and you can't buy radio time. You can put up posters and you can give talks. And so the things that would benefit us, the mass of people, were taken away, and the billionaires have increased so that 50% of American wealth is now owned by 1% of the people. And what happened is, within the loss of well-paid white male jobs, because Black people were always discriminated against, white women had to join their Black sisters in the labor force in order for their families to survive. And so what happened was women were expected to do a day's work. And in 1965, 1970, we got 59 cents on the male dollar. So we couldn't survive, particularly even by ourselves, no less with our children, on the wages we got. But the expectation was for women to work in the external labor force and then come home and do all the domestic labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, the child care, the after school care, the emotional care, the sexual care of their husbands. And this didn't go well for women. And as we have fought for more, more equal salaries, we now get 82% of what men earn, rather than 59 cents. And as women have flooded into new agencies and new possibilities, 70% of divorces are initiated by women because they have found that women married to men, even if they have children, they do a lot more domestic labor than if they were alone with their children. And a lot of women aren't signing up for that. Blue collar men who can't support wives are particularly affected because they want to be compensated for their lesser position in society because they get less money by extra sexual labor, emotional labor, childcare, housework, and women aren't signing up for it. And women aren't having children because it's too expensive. If you don't have insurance and you have a baby in the United States, it's 38,000, about on the average $38,700. If you have insurance, it's much less, but it's still $1,500 on average. So, and daycare for infants costs on average $21,000 a year. And so women are looking at marriage where they do extra work, they get less money because they're thinking of their domestic labor, and they have fewer opportunities, and then being bossed around by men. It's just not worth it. And so women are deserting marriage and children, and that's all over the world. The only place where women continue to have a lot of children is sub-Saharan Africa. But everywhere else in the world, I mean, in Japan, it's so bad that the Japanese government gives bars $35 a person to have mixers so people will get together, because over half of the men don't want to be involved. They don't want to have to support a wife in a traditional way, which Japanese men are obliged to do. And about 30% of women have nothing to do with the opposite sex. And that's true everywhere, because the way industry has developed has ignored a huge aspect of women's labor and imposed it on them after they're required to have a job to survive. And it's a bad deal. So women don't want it. People aren't having children all over the developed world. In Russia, Putin has now made a law forbidding the discussion of the problems around children in any of the airwaves. So mothers groups that used to talk about, oh, a kid does this and that, not allowed. There has to be this happy natalism. And that's where Vance is coming from, the vice president of the United States, that women's job is to breed, basically. And first of all, it's not viable economically. And second of all, women want more out of life. And they need to survive. Even though, of course, creating people is certainly as important as creating things. And we ought to be compensated handsomely for that. But the United States lacks things that other countries have, other countries whose populations are not being as drastically decimated as our population.
And the solution to this problem, I assume, will be very complex. But do you say, or do you think that the responsibility will fall more on industry, on policy, on cultural changes in terms of how do we get out of this kind of dysfunctional family kind of system we have now?
Well, I think it's a combination of all the things you mentioned. And we could look to other nations that do better. For example, the United States is one of only 5 countries of the world that doesn't give paid maternity leave as a guarantee. And those other countries are Swaziland, Somalia, Papua New Guinea, what's the other one? And some 2 Pacific islands that are very poor. So it's absolutely bizarre that we don't do that. And we could look to countries that have less population decimation and how they managed it. Places like France, that has just as diverse a population as the United States, but that has guaranteed maternity and paternity leaves. And a country like Norway forbids men from foregoing their paternity leave. They have to stay home with their kids. And so that you can stay home with your kids for up to 5 years in France if you want to. You're not paid as much. Otherwise, you get paid 80% of your salary and guaranteed that when you go back in the labor force, you will be on the same pay scale with the same kinds of conditions. And so you can make it more comfortable for women to leave the labor force and still survive. You can also have excellent childcare that's universal. In France, starting at 3 years old, you have excellent public daycare. And before that, you can put your child in a daycare and it's a little over $1 an hour. Okay. So that you're not trapped or giving inadequate daycare. For a while, I was an inspector of daycares. Poor women don't have much choice, particularly if it's poor single women, but poor married women, but putting their kid in inadequate daycare in wet diapers watching television, which is really bad for them. And people used to leave their kids with their grandparents and stuff, but they're working too because America requires that in order to survive. So women aren't getting married as often. They're not having children. There's because their future will be really curtailed by so doing. And industries like the sugar daddy industry, where women accompany men who are wealthy men for a lot of money, and they make up their contracts. Sometimes they involve sex, sometimes they don't. So that when the wealthy businessman comes to New York, if you're at, let's say, NYU, there's a whole sugar daddy university, you entertain him and go to business meetings. He has this attractive, intelligent woman on his arm, and your tuition is paid. That's one of the only areas where women do better than men economically. But those industries are burgeoning because of financial necessity. And women don't want to get married because they'll feel their husbands make more money. So if somebody's job is going to be sacrificed, it'll probably be theirs when they move. And they have domestic responsibilities, so they won't be able to go to conferences as easily or to hang out and get jobs after work and schmooze. I had a client who was an electrician, and the way he got his jobs was he went to the bar where people said, "Oh, we need, you have drinks. Oh, we need an electrician on this job or that job." There were very few women there because they had to get home. And so having the double responsibility, what Arlie Hochschild named in her book, the second shift, holds women back, and they don't want to be held back. And also, most marriages end in separation or divorce, although the figures are 50% for first marriages, 60% for second marriages, 73% for third marriages. That doesn't count about 15 or 20% of people who don't have assets to fight over, and they don't have children that they're willing to fight over. So they just split and they don't go through the legal system. A legal divorce costs on average in the United States $7,000. A lot of people don't have $7,000, so they make a deal with each other. And so you have the collapse of marriage and the collapse of the ability of women to care for children and to have the time and space to do that. And you don't have a child care system that allows women to do both. And so they're opting out. We're opting out, and that makes very good sense economically.
And it's such a complicated issue because I think for a lot of women my age, we were raised with this kind of like you can do anything, climb the career ladder. Like this is the moment for women to be independent, financially independent, and it's really hard and complicated to wrestle with all of the other kind of social consequences. I wouldn't say consequences necessarily, but like conditions that surround this movement. And I don't know, I think that probably one of the solution would be to offer more women, either childcare or the option to like, pause their career for a little bit. But how do you make sense of women who've grown up with this kind of like go, go, go career? Who was that for? Was that for them? Was it for corporate America? It's tons of different questions, but it's
Because women worked for less and they needed people in the social services industry, and women poured into those jobs. Some people who are very smart, people like Sheryl Sandberg, who is a CEO at Facebook, she wrote a book called Lean In, and she wrote another book. And in that book, she said, anyone can make it. Anyone can make it. She didn't mention that she had 9 servants. Well, anyone can make it if they have 9 servants to do a lot of the work. And she and her husband were both engaged in the work, but their house was cleaned, their laundry was done, their meals were prepared, and the children were cared for by other people when it was convenient. And so what has happened is that the people who can manage it are the 1% who have servants, usually other women, who do their cleaning, who do their cooking, or they go out to restaurants or get takeout where poorer people are making their meals. And they have elegant childcare, and then they have a nanny to pick them up at the childcare center, and so on. So that the whole landscape for them is different. And at the top, the 1% does have more children because because they don't have to have those sacrifices and an untenable life. Also, 2/3 of men don't support their children, not 2/3, I'm sorry, 2/5 after 5 years. So if you have a child and you count it on child support, it's often not generous at all. And the man goes on, he has another family, he leaves, and you're stuck.
What do you say to individual men and women? Although I assume the conversation would be different for the two. What do you say to individual men and women who are struggling with this kind of dysfunctional relationship that the two genders have? And it's not clear when some kind of policy or political movement is going to swoop in and save them. What do individuals do to make sense of uh, this issue?
Well, they fight for daycare. They try to get together and pool their resources so that they can have some kind of daycare that's a quality daycare center. And they try to manage that, or they try to, if their jobs allow them, to staff it within their cohort and all get together at a space. That's very hard. That's why Americans are so far behind, because we have inadequate childcare. And the options are few. And that's why Americans are not reproducing ourselves as a population, because it takes too much out of women who are refusing. And men don't want to support it either. So it's collapsed.
Yeah, it is such a strange, not something as a young person I really ever thought of, but I thought that we would be dealing with, and it is such a central issue for Gen Z. Even politically, you see Gen Z is completely divided by gender, and I think a lot of it is the dysfunctional kind of family relationships, interpersonal relationships, and a real struggle, even of kind of what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What do those roles look like anymore?
Well, I think they're more similar than they used to be, because everyone has to support her, him, themselves in a way that was not so 75 years ago. And also, since people's lives are much more precarious economically, you know, is it 40% of Americans don't have $500 in case of the worst emergency, and they can't get their hands on it. You're talking about an immiseration of a huge percentage of the American population, because money has been shifted upward, and we've lost the middle class and a prosperous working class. And our position in the world has changed. So we don't have as much of the world's wealth to distribute as we used to. Look, after World War II, every other developed economy was destroyed. And China was invaded by Japan, and also had a civil war and was one of the poorest countries in the world. Whatever criticisms you might make, the Chinese government lifted 750 million people out of extreme poverty. But they were not competing with us at the time of their revolution and the end of World War II. 1950 was the date of the Chinese Revolution. And so the United States was king of the world. The dollar was considered as good as gold. That's not true anymore. And so when the United States decides we're going to punish Russia, so they'll, dissolve, and we can bring with our European allies, revitalize our economies by plundering their natural resources, because Russia is the most natural resource country in the world. That didn't work out because the BRICS economic alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and it also now includes Egypt, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, and a couple of others, plus 23 countries that want to join it. All that happened was the Chinese and the Indians bought the Russian oil and gas and sold it at a profit. So Russia's economy is doing fine. So is China's and India's. And Europe, our allies who had to buy the cheap Russian gas and oil, like the Germans, are suffering terribly because we're not, although Trump acts like we are, we're not the kingpin that can order the world. No more. The US credit rating just went down. Now Moody's, Fitch, and Standard and Poor's, all the credit rating agencies, have lowered America's credit rating. We're still the richest country in the world, but the future doesn't look so good. And money is at the top, and most people are not there. And so they cut back. And one of the things they cut back on is arrangements like marriage or having children, because their lives are precarious and their jobs are precarious. It's really different and severe.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, especially on the right, romanticizing of the 50s. And I don't think for a number of reasons that's a period we can or should go back to. And I like to be an optimist and think that we can maybe create something better. But even I struggle to understand or envision what that is. And one of the things that I'm curious about your perspective on is that, the dual income home is now a norm in America. Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Does it need to be reworked? It's just an interesting, um, uh, is there a different scenario where women can have a career and have kids and at times work, but also be able to not, be doing all of the labor? It's a long-winded question, but
Well, of course, first of all, most Americans, I think it's 80 something percent of Americans, live in urban areas. I live in New York City. I live in Stuyvesant Town, where 44,000 people live, right? If you had industrialized housework where people came around and cleaned everybody's house, they could get decent jobs that cleaned houses. And you also had after school programs, even France has this excellent daycare, after school care, summer care, free. That would be a very different story. People would have more stability. If America has suffered terribly because starting in, so it was about the end of the 1940s, at the end of World War II, the big money of the United States, the big capitalist corporations, were really upset. FDR got them to agree to be taxed at 96.8% of their income, because otherwise their corporations would be taken over. There were two powerful socialist parties and a powerful communist party. And during World War II, the newspapers referred to Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe because the Russians were our primary ally in destroying the Nazis. And the Russians lost 30 million people in the war because they were invaded and decimated. And the industrialists and the big corporations in the United States were nervous. There was too much friendliness. FDR's cabinet, the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, was an outspoken socialist as well as feminist, and they didn't like the saturation of this country in communism and socialism. 1 out of 4 families had an active communist in it at the end of World War II. And fascism was the enemy. You couldn't have had Elon Musk doing the Nazi salute. It wouldn't have worked out. And so they, with the cooperation of the McCarthy's campaign on un-American activities, they cast the communists as overthrowing the government. They weren't like the January 6th people. They didn't try to overthrow the government, and that socialists were fellow travelers and so were leftists. And they deported people, they fired people, they jailed thousands of left people, and the unions lost their leftists, they kicked them out. And so they went from 33% unionized, which raises everyone's salaries, to what they are now, 11%. Huge. And so the workers were not organized. And the kind of alternative voice of another system wasn't there. We have the Republicans and Democrats, both capitalists. And in our latest election, Kamala Harris didn't say the United States is losing its empire. Incomes are much too polar. The mass of people are being cheated because the most popular jobs in America now are working at Walmart. It's terrible working conditions. They even have a person in the front office of every Walmart showing you how to get food stamps because they give them such a crappy salary that they need food stamps. So there's Walmart, Amazon, fast food, and call centers, and all of them, you're on the clock. Beep, beep. If you haven't made your burger in 2 minutes, 53 seconds, you haven't gotten people out the door, you're beeped and you're held accountable by your supervisor on all those jobs. Walmart, you're not beeped, but somebody monitors and comes over and talks to you if you're not walking around your department looking for customers, even though nobody's there. You can't sit down. And so they're in degrading low-wage jobs, minimum wage jobs. And the national minimum wage hasn't changed. For the longest time, it's $7.25. Now in New York, it's $15, but that's still not enough. And people are immiserated. And so they don't feel they have a future, and they don't plan on one. They're not going to get married and have children the way they used to, because that kind of permanence and assumption of a future doesn't exist. There's a book by Emily Gindelsberger called On the Clock that really goes into this. But those are figures you can get off Google. They're not some kind of arcane lefty figures that you have to figure out yourself. So, we really are in a crisis. And Kamala Harris did not say that. Trump alluded to it. We'll make America great again, as if it's not so great now. But then what he did was a neat little trick. Since the feminist movement rose in the late 60s and 70s, and the civil rights and Black Power movements rose in the mid to late 50s and 70s, he allocated the blame for the immiseration of the American people to women, uppity women, and Black people, and immigrants who are the poorest paid, doing the worst jobs. 60% of the dishwashers in Manhattan restaurants in New York are immigrants, because that's who gets the worst job. They're the people who pick the fruit and stuff. And they can't complain if they're cheated. If they're illegal, they can't complain. But fascists always try to divide the mass of people so they can hate each other instead of look at who's robbing them at the top. And that's what's happened. And so young people in this uncertain economy, with its poorly paid jobs and lack of a future, it's not like you work your way up when you pick fruit or when you wash dishes, or if you're working on Amazon or Walmart. If you work in fast food, you could become a manager, but that doesn't pay well either. And so that they don't have much of a future. So they don't plan one in the same way. It's rather realistic and sad.
It's yeah, I would say the majority of Gen Zers probably feel like there's no hope in the future or relying on the future, and that is a very scary way of thinking that permeates out into a lot of aspects of our current life, culture, socialization, what have you. It's again, I try to be very optimistic, but it's a dark moment for
It's,
American young people.
it is. And 1 out of 3, according to the latest um, polls, 1 out of 3 Americans is very lonely. And loneliness has the same health effects as smoking 3 packs a day. It's very bad for you to be disengaged from other people. Solitary confinement is the worst punishment. It's torture. And so that I think the remedy would be people getting together in unions, in political movements, in opposition to terrible things that are happening, and an affirmation of a better United States would both connect people in ways we desperately need to be connected and also make the changes that we need. Because one of the reasons that so many other countries are ahead of us is they have powerful left movements that get into the street when they're mistreated. And ours was crushed. It had a slight rise in 2011 with the Occupy movements, but Obama, who's also a capitalist, had them all destroyed on the same day. They lasted only a few months. And yet the need for class analysis was so strong, the idea lasted of the 1%, 99% in this country. But we don't have that tradition, and we need one desperately. And we're starting to. 16,000 people joined unions in 2024, and I'm sorry, 16 million. And 24 million wanted to, but were stopped by a lot of anti union laws because people are realizing we make everything. We've got to get together, and we would have the power to stop it all and say no. And that will be the solution. Getting together in political, social movements to change these unjust practices and adjust to a new reality, like excellent full-time childcare and after-school care and summer care and public summer camps and long parental leaves and maternity and paternity leaves and free health care. And these aren't far out things. They're there in Holland. They're there in France. They're there in other countries which are far less violent than ours. It would be a different landscape and possible.
Loneliness is something I think a lot about in the context of this project. And I think in one of your videos you were talking about some of some of these issues as like, they sound woo-woo, but they're very important. And I feel the same way. Like it sounds so fuzzy to be talking about this emotional stuff, but it is so crucial to what humans need. And I think, I'd love to get a sense from you between just your, kind of uh, projections, your understanding of history. Like, do you think the US can course correct on the loneliness issue? Like, do you have faith that we actually can Um,
Well, we have had mass movements, which is why FDR could do the New Deal and get the wealthy to pay 96.8% of their wealth. We also could, with a mass movement, change the whole structure of taxes. When the income tax was started, it started at $125,000 a year. Nobody else had to pay. And that was a time when really the dollar was 10 times, maybe a tenth of the population made $125,000 a year. And what we could do is have a progressive tax structure. We have taxes on the forms of property that middle class people could have: a car, a home. We don't have any on wealth, on stocks and bonds. We don't have any on gold. We don't have any on famous paintings in your house. We don't have extra tax on second and third and fourth homes. Whoa, these are a tax structure geared towards the rich who the politicians want to pay for their campaigns. So it becomes all about what's her name said. It's all about the Benjamins, you know. And if the billionaires control politics because rather than tax them, we loan to them and pay them interest on their money. And only people um, with a car or a little house or something pay their taxes. And so that the tax structure would have to be changed. And nothing will be changed without mass movements. And they are possible. We've had them in the past. That's why FDR got his friends to agree to 96.8% tax on their wealth. And so, of course, it's possible. And since it's all the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway produces a lot of oil, but the government owns the oil and disperses in services. Why do people individually own oil? They get oil producers get an oil depletion allowance for taking the oil which is under all of our ground and making money off it. The government has been usurped by the wealthy, and we'd have to change that with a mass movement which would connect us. It would give Americans a life with more of a purpose and social connection. The socialists at the turn of the century, in about 1912, I think it was, had that song, Bread and Roses, give us bread, but give us roses, which was the inspiring song of what they called the Bread and Roses strike, the Lawrence Mill strikes, where 51,000 people of different languages organized to stop those mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, so that people could get benefits. And the song that they sang was Bread and Roses. We want bread, but we want roses too. So we want kindness, and we want libraries, and we want artwork, and we want all the things that the WPA tried to bring to people under FDR. And they quickly closed that one down.
in a similar vein, you say that the American left doesn't talk enough about love. What did you mean by that?
What I mean is the agenda of better salaries and so on is one thing. An agenda of we need connection, we need each other, we need to celebrate that we are people who we share our work, we share our organization, and we want sharing and we want kindness. And you can't afford it in a capitalist system where everybody's competing against each other and where the whole premise of capitalism is you get rich because you hire someone and you never give them what they're worth to you, and you take the profit and enrich yourself. It's not nice. There's no question. It's just not nice. if you had a kinder system so that the work was co-ops and people decided, okay, we produced this. What do we want to do with the proceeds? You know, one year I went to Mondragon, which is a city of co-ops in Spain, 104 co-ops. And we went through this big factory, the Frigor factory that makes washing machines and refrigerators and so on. And first of all, a buzzer goes off every 2 hours because nobody should have to work at a job that's repetitive for more than 2 hours. Secondly, we talked to a woman who was a woman working with 5 different people, putting parts in the washing machine's shelves, the shelves, the other things in a washing machine, motors, shelves, and so on. And we talked to her about the fact that since it was in 2008 and resorts in Spain weren't doing well, they weren't ordering as many appliances for their new condos for those resorts. So, how did they deal with that? And she said, well, we have mandatory cooperative movements, meetings. Everyone has to go to the meeting and contribute. And we had to decide, what do we want to do in Frigor? Do we want to fire people and have them work in other co-ops if they can? Do we want to take a day of work off? Do we want to lower everyone's salary? What? Because we're not working as many days? And we decided we would work a 4-day week instead of 5-day. We would get paid a little less and everybody would be on the job. Well, that's a very different way of doing it, to have the people who are workers figure it out. And the United States is quite remiss on this. You know, in Germany, if you have a factory with over 2,000 workers, you have to have a third of the seats on your board of directors held by workers. You also have to have a portion held by the people in the neighborhood who are ecologically affected by what you make. So people are not going to vote for outsourcing their jobs. That's a profit decision that sacrifices millions of people. So that if you had laws requiring that boards of directors had to include portions of workers, and you have to have, if you have a factory with more than, I think it's 5,000 workers, you have to have 50% of your board has to be workers. That prevents them doing things that are for profit that deny workers. You could restructure things the way other people have. New buildings in Sweden, for a long time, they're adjusting to that young people aren't getting married so much. And people are living alone and they're lonely. And so they were building apartments where there's small apartments and then big communal space. So people make dinners together, they watch movies together, and very successful. There are a few of those, particularly in California, and they cost a mint. So you're not isolated. But they don't have to cost a mint. When they had a brief experiment, which was successful and they didn't repeat it, where a woman created this idea where they bought a single room occupancy hotels in New York and upgraded them and made tiny apartments and big communal spaces with collective activities and movies and dinners that they cooked together. And they put in them Medicare recipients with high bills in Medicare. And the bills went way down because loneliness makes you sick. If you think about people's needs rather than just what will benefit the people who will pay for my next campaign, you have a different set of values. And of course we could do that. It's done elsewhere. We could do it too. It's just, we don't have the realist. Our left was crushed. Those ideas are not widely held. You know, recently I was in France and I noticed that The newsstand has the communist newspaper, the socialist newspaper of this tendency and that tendency, the capitalist newspaper. And once, when I was in France during elections, since you're not allowed to have private bought TV or radio time, they have government paid for time where all that time there were 8 candidates for one office where they get to talk about what they stand for. So everybody sees it, but nobody's bribed. Of course, we could have these things. Other countries do. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, France, Holland. They're all there. It's just that we haven't understood. Our left was wiped out, and it's the left that has those visions of kindness. And that's also the roses, creating a society that inspires kindness to other people, where you don't get rich by giving people less than their labor is worth. Nobody hires anybody in the United States unless they're making more money from that person than they would be if the person weren't working. So the person gets a salary and a portion goes to the boss who gets rich. There's 3% of our population are employers and 97% are employees. So this, if we could get together, of course we'd do it. It's possible.
Do you
And then
think
roses and red.
do you think that includes aligning with the new right or populist right on some of these issues or causes? I had an interesting conversation with a kind of pro-family conservative. He's pushed back on some of the weird pro-natalist stuff, but um, he's written about how there are a lot of red states actually that are adopting pro-family policy and outpacing blue states on kind of the work that they're doing. And I just would be curious to hear your perspective on that new kind of like horseshoe, I guess, that's happening. And does it make sense for the left to partner with the right on some of this stuff?
Yes, to partner with anyone who wants what we want for the mass of the American people. The point is to win a kinder nation of egalitarian relationships, however we can. And on some things, of course, we could have alliances, not on who gets to keep the massive wealth and who doesn't, but certainly on certain things like providing childcare, maybe, or other such things, family leave, vacation. In France, every employee is guaranteed 5 weeks paid vacation. And they can separate it out in different ways, but most of them go away for the month of August because they have a paid vacation. We don't have that. We don't have any guaranteed paid vacation. And that's sad. And we have almost $1 trillion we spend on armaments. When we've lost the last 3 wars, it's kind of crazy. And we're now losing the proxy war in Ukraine and spending billions on that. It's unnecessary. It's more than 7 times more than anyone else in the world has. So we could provide for our people, but there isn't even a political party that stands for that at this time. And we need one badly.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. There are so many questions I could ask. I guess, maybe lastly, just some of the ideas you're talking about, I think, are very attractive or would be very attractive to most Americans. And then when it is attached to some label, whether that's socialism or whatever else, people get really scared.
That's
Um,
right.
how do we, from all political kind of belief systems, like how do we reckon with, um, choosing policies that are good for people and not getting caught up in, um, you know, many years of propaganda and yeah.
Well, I think people would have to realize, which I do think they are doing now, this isn't working for them and they need something different. I think one of the reasons that Trump won is he said he's going to make change. Now he made fascist change. They didn't bargain for that. But he was saying, make America great again. What he meant is take us back to the 1950s without civil rights for women or people of color. But people want change. Americans are very dissatisfied. And if you had a program where it isn't that you blame some group that has nothing to do with it, like immigrants or trans people, but you emphasize that we need each other. And that's why we're together. And we'll take back our country. That was Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in their very, very popular rallies for their new revolution party. That's what you need here. Our revolution party. And it won't be financed by the top. And I think people are really upset and getting ready to look for solutions where they wouldn't have before. So we need to provide them.
Yeah, I think getting a mix of good, policy people and good communicators who can articulate um, why these make sense, these policies make sense for people is important. And I just really appreciate all the work that you do. Again, more people have to be talking about the woo-woo stuff, and not enough do. And it is so integral to why Americans are like suffering and struggling in the way that they are. It's not just economic. I mean, it's downstream from economics, but it's also, the way you feel about yourself and your community.
That's right. And your hope and your sense of purpose,
Hmm.
kindness that we all need to flourish.
Hmm.
Those are very important. And capitalism does not breed kindness because the idea is make more money off of somebody else, not share. It's like in childcare, you don't reward the kid who steals all the tricycles and then takes everyone's lunch to have a ride. No, you're supposed to share to civilize children, but it'll last a little longer. You know.
So thank you so much for having this conversation. This was lovely.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad I did.